Chapter 11 of the Holy War. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Joy Chan. The Holy War by John Bunyan. Chapter 11. Well, when the Sabbath day was come, they went to hear their subordinate preacher. But oh, how he did thunder and lighten this day! His text was that in the prophet Jonah, "They that observe lying vanities forsake their own mercy." But there was then such power and authority in that sermon, and such a dejection seen in the countenances of the people that day, that the like hath seldom been heard or seen. The people, when sermon was done, were scarce able to go to their homes or to betake themselves to their employs the week after. They were so sermon smitten, and also so sermon sick by being smitten, that they knew not what to do. He did not only show to man's soul their sin, but did tremble before them under the sense of his own, still crying out of himself as he preached to them. Unhappy man that I am, that I should do so wicked a thing, that I, a preacher, whom the prince did set up to teach to man's soul his law, should myself live senseless and sottishly here, and be one of the first found in transgression. This transgression also fell within my precincts. I should have cried out against the wickedness, but I let man's soul lie wallowing in it, until it had driven Emmanuel from its borders. With these things he also charged all the lords and gentry of man's soul, to the almost distracting of them. About this time also there was a great sickness in the town of man's soul, and most of the inhabitants were greatly afflicted. Yea, the captains also, and men of war were brought thereby to a languishing condition, and that for a long time together, so that in case of an invasion nothing could to purpose now have been done, either by the townsmen or field officers. Oh, how many pale faces, weak hands, feeble knees, and staggering men were now seen to walk the streets of man's soul! Here were groans, there pants, and yonder lay those that were ready to faint. The garments too which Emmanuel had given them were but in a sorry case. Some were rent, some were torn, and all in a nasty condition. Some also did hang so loosely upon them that the next bush they came at was ready to pluck them off. After some time spent in this sad and desolate condition, the subordinate preacher called for a day of fasting, and to humble themselves for being so wicked against the great Shaddai and his Son. And he desired that Captain Boanerges would preach. So he consented to do it, and the day being come, and his text was this: "Cut it down, why cumbereth it the ground?" And a very smart sermon he made upon the place. First he showed what was the occasion of the words, namely, because the fig tree was barren. Then he showed what was retained in the sentence, namely, repentance or utter desolation. He then showed also by whose authority this sentence was pronounced, and that was by Shaddai himself. And lastly, he showed the reasons of the point, and then concluded his sermon. But he was very pertinent in the application, insomuch that he made poor man's soul tremble, for this sermon, as well as the former, wrought much upon the hearts of the men of man's soul. Yea, it greatly helped to keep awake those that were roused by the preaching that went before. So that now throughout the whole town there was little or nothing to be heard or seen but sorrow and mourning and woe. Now after sermon they got together and consulted what was best to be done. "But," said the subordinate preacher, "I will do nothing of mine own head, without advising with my neighbour, Mr. Godly Fear. For if he had aforehand understood more of the mind of our prince than we, I do not know but he also may have it now, even now we are turning again to virtue." So they called and sent for Mr. Godly Fear, and he forthwith appeared. Then they desired that he would further show his opinion about what they had best to do. Then said the old gentleman as followeth: "It is my opinion that this town of man's soul should, in this day of her distress, draw up and send an humble petition to their offended Prince Emmanuel, that he in his favour and grace will turn again unto you, and not keep anger for ever." When the townsmen had heard this speech, they did with one consent agree to his advice. So they did presently draw up their request, and the next was, but who shall carry it? At last they did all agree to send it by my Lord Mayor. So he accepted of the service, and addressed himself to his journey, and went and came to the court of Shaddai, whither Emmanuel the prince of man's soul was gone. But the gate was shut, and a strict watch kept thereat, so that the petitioner was forced to stand without for a great while together. Then he desired that some would go in to the prince, and tell him who stood at the gate, and what his business was. So one went and told to Shaddai, to Emmanuel his son, that the Lord Mayor of the town of Man's Soul stood without at the gate of the king's court, desiring to be admitted into the presence of the prince, the king's son. He also told what was the Lord Mayor's errand, both to the king and his son Emmanuel. But the prince would not come down, nor admit that the gate should be opened to him, but sent him an answer to this effect: They have turned their back unto me, and not their face. But now in the time of their trouble they say to me, Arise and save us. But can they not now go to Mr. Carnal Security, to whom they went when they turned from me, and make him their leader, their lord, and their protection now in their trouble? Why now in their trouble do they visit me, since in their prosperity they went astray? The answer made my Lord Mayor look black in the face. It troubled, it perplexed, it rent him sore. And now he began again to see what it was to be familiar with Dibelonians, such as Mr. Carnal Security was. When he saw that at court, as yet, there was little help to be expected, either for himself or friends in Man's Soul, he smote upon his breast and returned weeping, and all the way bewailing the lamentable state of Man's Soul. Well, when he was come within sight of the town, the elders and chief of the people of Man's Soul went out at the gate to meet him, and to salute him, and to know how he sped at court. But he told them his tale in so doleful a manner that they all cried out, and mourned, and wept. Wherefore they threw ashes and dust upon their heads, and put sackcloth upon their loins, and went crying out through the town of Man's Soul. The which, when the rest of the townsfolk saw, they all mourned and wept. This therefore was a day of rebuke and trouble, and of anguish to the town of Man's Soul, and also of great distress. After some time, when they had somewhat refrained themselves, they came together to consult again what by them was yet to be done, and they asked advice, as they did before, of that reverend Mr. Godly Fear, who told them that there was no way better than to do as they had done, nor would he that they should be discouraged at all with what they had met with at court. Yea, though several of their petitions should be answered with naught but silence or rebuke. For, said he, it is the way of the wise Shaddai to make men wait and to exercise patience, and it should be the way of them in want to be willing to stay his leisure. Then they took courage and sent again, and again, and again, and again. For there was not now one day nor an hour that went over Man's Soul's head, wherein a man might not have met upon the road one or other riding post, sounding the horn from Man's Soul to the court of the King Shaddai, and all with letters petitionary in behalf of and for the prince's return to Man's Soul. The road, I say, was now full of messengers going and returning and meeting one another, some from the court and some from Man's Soul, and this was the work of the miserable town of Man's Soul, all that long, that sharp, that cold and tedious winter. Now, if you have not forgot, you may yet remember that I told you before, that after Emmanuel had taken Man's Soul, yea, and after that he had new modelled the town, there remained in several lurking places of the corporation many of the old Dibelonians, that either came with the tyrant when he invaded and took the town, or that had there, by reason of unlawful mixtures, their birth and breeding and bringing up, and their holes, dens, and lurking places were in, under, or about the wall of the town. Some of their names are the Lord Fornication, the Lord Adultery, the Lord Murder, the Lord Anger, the Lord Lasciviousness, the Lord Deceit, the Lord Evil Eye, the Lord Blasphemy, and that horrible villain, the old and dangerous Lord Covetousness. These, as I told you, with many more, had yet their abode in the town of Man's Soul, and that after that Emmanuel had driven their prince Diabolus out of the castle. Against these the good prince did grant a commission to the Lord Wilbywill and others, yea, to the whole town of Man's Soul, to seek, take, secure, and destroy any or all that they could lay hands on, for that they were Dibelonians by nature, enemies to the prince, and those that sought to ruin the blessed town of Mansoul. But the town of Mansoul did not pursue this warrant, but neglected to look after, to apprehend, to secure, and to destroy these Babylonians. Wherefore what do these villains but by degrees take courage to put forth their heads, and to show themselves to the inhabitants of the town? Yea, and as I was told, some of the men of Mansoul grew too familiar with some of them, to the sorrow of the corporation, as you yet will hear more of in time and place. Well, when the Babylonian lords that were left perceived that Mansoul had, through sinning, offended Emmanuel their prince, and that he had withdrawn himself and was gone, what did they but plot the ruin of the town of Mansoul? So upon a time they met together at the hold of one Mr. Mischief, who was also a Babylonian, and there consulted how they might deliver up Mansoul into the hands of Diabolus again. Now some advised one way, and some another, every man according to his own liking. At last my lord lasciviousness propounded whether it might not be best in the first place for some of those that were Babylonians in Mansoul to adventure to offer themselves for servants to some of the natives of the town. For, said he, if they so do, and Mansoul shall accept of them, they may for us, and for Diabolus our lord, make the taking of the town of Mansoul more easy than otherwise it will be. But then stood up the Lord Murder, and said, This may not be done at this time, for Mansoul is now in a kind of a rage, because by our friend Mr. Carnal Security she hath been once ensnared already, and made to offend against her prince. And how shall she reconcile herself unto her lord again, but by the heads of these men? Besides, we know that they have in commission to take and slay us wherever they shall find us. Let us therefore be wise as foxes. When we are dead, we can do them no hurt, but while we live we may. Thus, when they had tossed the matter to and fro, they jointly agreed that a letter should forthwith be sent away to Diabolus in their name, by which the state of the town of Mansoul should be shewed him, and how much it is under the frowns of their prince. We may also, said some, let him know our intentions, and ask of him his advice in the case. So a letter was presently framed, the contents of which were these: To our great lord, the Prince Diabolus, dwelling below in the infernal cave. O great father and mighty Prince Diabolus, we, the true Diabolonians, yet remaining in the rebellious town of Mansoul, having received our beings from thee, and our nourishment at thy hands, cannot with content and quiet endure to behold, as we do this day, how thou art dispraised, disgraced, and reproached among the inhabitants of this town. Nor is thy long absence at all delightful to us, because greatly to our detriment. The reason of this our writing unto our Lord is for that we are not altogether without hope that this town may become thy habitation again. For it is greatly declined from its prince Emmanuel, and he is uprisen and is departed from them. Yea, and though they send and send and send and send after him to return to them, yet can they not prevail, nor get good words from him. There has been also of late, and is yet remaining, a very great sickness and fainting among them, and that not only upon the poorer sort of the town, but upon the lords, captains, and chief gentry of the place. We only who are of the Babylonians by nature remain well, lively, and strong, so that through their great transgression on the one hand, and their dangerous sickness on the other, we judge they lie open to thy hand and power. If therefore it shall stand with thy horrible cunning, and with the cunning of the rest of the princes with thee, to come and make an attempt to take Mansoul again, send us word, and we shall to our utmost power be ready to deliver it into thy hand. Or if what we have said shall not by thy fatherhood be thought best and most meet to be done, send us thy mind in a few words, and we are all ready to follow thy counsel, to the hazarding of our lives, and what else we have. Given under our hands the day and date above written, after a close consultation at the house of Mr. Mischief, who is yet alive, and hath his place in our desirable town of Mansoul. When Mr. Profane, for he was the carrier, was come with his letter to Hellgate Hill, he knocked at the brazen gates for entrance. Then did Cerberus, the porter, for he is the keeper of that gate, open to Mr. Profane, to whom he delivered his letter, which he had brought from the Babylonians in Mansoul. So he carried it in, and presented it to Diabolus his lord, and said, Tidings, my lord, from man's soul, from our trusty friends in man's soul. Then came together from all places of the den Beelzebub, Lucifer, Apollyon, with the rest of the rabblement there, to hear what news from man's soul. So the letter was broken up and read, and Cerberus he stood by. When the letter was openly read, and the contents thereof spread into all the corners of the den, command was given that, without let or stop, did man's bell should be rung for joy. So the bell was rung, and the princes rejoiced that man's soul was likely to come to ruin. Now the clapper of the bell went, The town of man's soul is coming to dwell with us. Make room for the town of man's soul. This bell therefore they did ring, because they did hope that they should have man's soul again. Now when they had performed this their horrible ceremony, they got together again to consult what answer to send to their friends in man's soul, and some advised one thing, and some another. But at length, because the business required haste, they left the whole business to the Prince Diabolus, judging him the most proper lord of the place. So he drew up a letter as he thought fit, in answer to what Mr. Profane had brought, and sent it to the Diabolonians that did dwell in man's soul, by the same hand that had brought theirs to him. And these were the contents thereof. To our offspring, the high and mighty Diabolonians, that yet dwell in the town of man's soul, Diabolus, the great prince of man's soul, wisheth a prosperous issue and conclusion of those many brave enterprises, conspiracies, and designs, that you of your love and respect to our honour have in your hearts to attempt to do against man's soul. Beloved children and disciples, my lord fornication, adultery, and the rest, we have here in our desolate den received, to our highest joy and content, your welcome letter, by the hand of our trusty Mr. Profane. And to show you how acceptable your tidings were, we rang out our bell for gladness. For we rejoiced as much as we could, when we perceived that yet we had friends in man's soul, and such as sought our honour and revenge in the ruin of the town of man's soul. We also rejoiced to hear that they are in a degenerated condition, and that they have offended their prince, and that he is gone. Their sickness also pleaseth us, as does also your health, might, and strength. Glad also would we be, right horribly beloved, could we get this town into our clutches again. Nor will we be sparing of spending our wit, our cunning, our craft, and hellish inventions to bring to a wished conclusion this your brave beginning in order thereto. And take this for your comfort, our birth and our offspring, that shall we again surprise it and take it, we will attempt to put all your foes to the sword, and will make you the great lords and captains of the place. Nor need you fear, if ever we get it again, that we after that shall be cast out any more, for we will come with more strength, and so lay far more fast hold than at the first we did. Besides, it is the law of that prince that now they own, that if we get them a second time, they shall be ours for ever. Do you therefore, our trusty Diabolonians, yet more pry into and endeavour to spy out the weakness of the town of man's soul. We also would that you yourselves do attempt to weaken them more and more. Send us word also by what means you think we had best to attempt the regaining thereof, namely, whether by persuasion to a vain and loose life, or whether by tempting them to doubt and despair, or whether by blowing up of the town by the gunpowder of pride and self-conceit. Do you also, O ye brave Diabolonians, and true sons of the pit, be always in a readiness to make a most hideous assault within, when we shall be ready to storm it without. Now speed you in your project, and we in our desires, to the utmost power of our gates, which is the wish of your great Diabolus, man's soul's enemy, and him that trembles when he thinks of judgment to come. All the blessings of the pit be upon you, and so we close up our letter. Given at the pit's mouth, by the joint consent of all the princes of darkness, to be sent, to the force and power that we have yet remaining in man's soul, by the hand of Mr. Profane, by me, Diabolus. This letter, as was said, was sent to man's soul, to the Diabolonians that yet remained there, and that yet inhabited the wall, from the dark dungeon of Diabolus, by the hand of Mr. Profane, by whom they also in man's soul sent theirs to the pit. Now when this Mr. Profane had made his return, and was come to man's soul again, he went and came as he was wont to the house of Mr. Mischief, for there was the conclave, and the place where the contrivers were met. Now when they saw that their messenger was returned safe and sound, they were greatly gladded thereat. Then he presented them with his letter which he had brought from Diabolus for them, the which, when they had read and considered, did much augment their gladness. They asked him after the welfare of their friends, as how their lord Diabolus, Lucifer, and Beelzebub did with the rest of those of the den. To which this Profane made answer, Well, well, my lords, they are well, even as well as can be in their place. They also, said he, did ring for joy at the reading of your letter, as you well perceived by this when you read it. Now as was said, when they had read their letter, and perceived that it encouraged them in their work, they fell to their way of contriving again, namely, how they might complete their Dibylonian design upon man's soul. And the first thing that they agreed upon was to keep all things from man's soul, as close as they could. Let it not be known, let not man's soul be acquainted with what we design against it. The next thing was, how, or by what means, they should try to bring to pass the ruin and overthrow of man's soul. And one said after this manner, and another said after that. Then stood up Mr. Deceit, and said, My right Dibylonian friends, our lords, and the high ones of the deep dungeon, do propound unto us these 3 ways. 1, whether we had best to seek its ruin by making man's soul loose and vain. 2, or whether by driving them to doubt and despair. 3, or whether by endeavouring to blow them up by the gunpowder of pride and self-conceit. Now I think, if we shall tempt them to pride, that may do something, and if we tempt them to wantonness, that may help. But in my mind, if we could drive them into desperation, that would knock the nail on the head, for then we should have them, in the first place, question the truth of the love of the heart of their prince towards them, and that will disgust him much. This, if it works well, will make them leave off quickly their way of sending petitions to him. Then farewell earnest solicitations for help and supply. For then this conclusion lies naturally before them, as good do nothing, as do to no purpose. So to Mr. Deceit they unanimously did consent. Then the next question was, But how shall we do to bring this our project to pass? And it was answered by the same gentleman that this might be the best way to do it. Even let, quoth he, so many of our friends as are willing to venture themselves for the promoting of their prince's cause, disguise themselves with apparel, change their names, and go into the market like far countrymen, and proffer to let themselves for servants to the famous town of man's soul, and let them pretend to do for their masters as beneficially as may be. For by so doing they may, if man's soul shall hire them, in little time so corrupt and defile the corporation, that her now prince shall be not only further offended with them, but in conclusion shall spew them out of his mouth. And when this is done, our prince Diabolus shall prey upon them with ease. Yea, of themselves they shall fall into the mouth of the eater. This project was no sooner propounded, but was as highly accepted, and forward were all Dibylonians now to engage in so delicate an enterprise. But it was not thought fit that all should do thus, wherefore they pitched upon 2 or 3, namely, the Lord Covetousness, the Lord Lasciviousness, and the Lord Anger. The Lord Covetousness called himself by the name of Prudent Thrifty, the Lord Lasciviousness called himself by the name of Harmless Mirth, and the Lord Anger called himself by the name of Good Zeal. So upon a market day they came into the market-place, 3 lusty fellows they were to look on, and they were clothed in sheep's russet, which was also now in a manner as white as were the white robes of the men of man's soul. Now the men could speak the language of man's soul well. So when they were come into the market-place, and had offered to let themselves to the townsmen, they were presently taken up. For they asked but little wages, and promised to do their masters great service. Mr. Mind hired Prudent Thrifty, and Mr. Godly Fear hired Good Zeal. True, this fellow Harmless Mirth did hang a little in hand, and could not so soon get him a master as the others did, because the town of man's soul was now in Lent. But after a while, because Lent was almost out, the Lord Will-be-will hired harmless Mirth to be both his waiting man and his lackey, and thus they got themselves masters. These villains now being got thus far into the houses of the men of Mansoul, quickly began to do so great mischief therein. For, being filthy, arch, and sly, they quickly corrupted the families where they were. Yea, they tainted their masters much, especially this prudent Thrifty, and him they call harmless Mirth. True, he that went under the visor of good Zeal was not so well liked of his master, for he quickly found that he was but a counterfeit rascal. The which when the fellow perceived, with speed he made his escape from the house, or I doubt not but his master had hanged him. Well, when these vagabonds had thus far carried on their design, and had corrupted the town as much as they could, in the next place they considered with themselves at what time their prince Diabolus without, and themselves within the town, should make an attempt to seize upon Mansoul. And they all agreed upon this, that a market day would be best for that work. For why? Then will the townsfolk be busy in their ways, and always take this for a rule, when people are most busy in the world, they least fear surprise. We also then, said they, shall be able with this less suspicion to gather ourselves together for the work of our friends and lords. Yea, and in such a day if we shall attempt our work and miss it, we may, when they shall give us the rout, the better hide ourselves in the crowd and escape. These things being thus far agreed upon by them, they wrote another letter to Diabolus and sent it by the hand of Mr. Profane, the contents of which were these. The lords of looseness send to the great and high Diabolus from our dens, caves, holes, and strongholds, in and about the wall of the town of Mansoul, greeting. Our great lord and the nourisher of our lives, Diabolus, how glad we were when we heard of your fatherhood's readiness to comply with us, and help forward our design in our attempts to ruin Mansoul. None can tell but those who, as we do, set themselves against all appearance of good, when and wheresoever we find it. Touching the encouragement that your greatness is pleased to give us to continue to devise, contrive, and study the utter desolation of Mansoul, that we are not solicitous about. For we know right well that it cannot but be pleasing and profitable to us to see our enemies and them that seek our lives die at our feet or fly before us. We therefore are still contriving, and that to the best of our cunning, to make this work most facile and easy to your lordships and to us. First, we considered of that most hellishly cunning, compacted, threefold project, that by you was propounded to us in your last, and have concluded, that though to blow them up with the gunpowder of pride would do well, and to do it by tempting them to be loose and vain will help on, yet to contrive to bring them into the gulf of desperation, we think will do best of all. Now we who are at your beck have thought of 2 ways to do this. First, we, for our parts, will make them as vile as we can, and then you with us at a time appointed shall be ready to fall upon them with the utmost force. And of all the nations that are at your whistle, we think that an army of doubters may be the most likely to attack and overcome the town of Mansoul. Thus shall we overcome these enemies, else the pit shall open her mouth upon them, and desperation shall thrust them down into it. We have also to effect this so much by us desired design, sent already 3 of our trusty Diabolonians among them. They are disguised in garb, they have changed their names, and are now accepted of them, namely, covetousness, lasciviousness, and anger. The name of covetousness is changed to prudent Thrifty, and him Mr. Mind has hired, and is almost become as bad as our friend. Lasciviousness has changed his name to harmless Mirth, and he is got to be the Lord Will-be-will's lackey, but he has made his master very wanton. Anger changed his name into Good Zeal, and was entertained by Mr. Godly Fear, but the peevish old gentleman took pepper in the nose, and turned our companion out of his house. Nay, he has informed us since that he ran away from him, or else his old master had hanged him up for his labour. Now these have much helped forward our work and design upon Mansoul, for notwithstanding the spite and quarrelsome temper of the old gentleman last mentioned, the other 2 ply their business well, and are likely to ripen the work apace. Our next project is, that it be concluded that you come upon the town upon a market day, and that when they are upon the heat of their business. For then, to be sure, they will be most secure, and least think an assault will be made upon them. They will also at such a time be less able to defend themselves and to offend you in the prosecution of our design. And we, your trusty, and we are sure your beloved, ones shall, when you shall make your furious assault without, be ready to second the business within. So shall we in all likelihood be able to put man's soul to utter confusion, and to swallow them up before they can come to themselves. If your serpentine heads and most subtile dragons, and our highly esteemed lords can find out a better way than this, let us quickly know your minds. To the monsters of the infernal cave, from the house of Mr. Mischief in man's soul, by the hand of Mr. Profane. End of chapter 11. Of the Holy War. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Joy Chan. The Holy War by John Bunyan. Chapter 12. Now all the while that the raging runagates and hellish Diabolonians were thus contriving the ruin of the town of Mansoul, they, namely the poor town itself, were in a sad and woeful case, partly because they had so grievously offended Shaddai and his son, and partly because that the enemies thereby got strength within them afresh, and also because, though they had by many petitions made suit to the Prince Emmanuel and to his father Shaddai by him, for their pardon and favour, yet hitherto obtained they not one smile, but contrariwise, through the craft and subtlety of the domestic Diabolonians, their cloud was made to grow blacker and blacker, and their Emmanuel to stand at farther distance. The sickness also did still greatly rage in man's soul, both among the captains and the inhabitants of the town, and their enemies only were now lively and strong, and likely to become the head, whilst man's soul was made the tail. By this time the letter last mentioned, that was written by the Diabolonians that yet lurked in the town of Mansoul, was conveyed to Diabolus in the black den by the hand of Mr. Profane. He carried the letter by Hellgate Hill as afore, and conveyed it by Cerberus to his lord. But when Cerberus and Mr. Profane did meet, they were presently as great as beggars, and thus they fell into discourse about Mansoul, and about the project against her. "Ah, old friend," quoth Cerberus, "art thou come to Hellgate Hill again? By Saint Mary, I am glad to see thee." Profane. "Yes, my lord, I am come again about the concerns of the town of Mansoul." Cerberus. "Prithee, tell me what condition is that town of Mansoul in at present?" Profane. "In a brave condition, my lord, for us and for my lords, the lords of this place, I trow. For they are greatly decayed as to godliness, and that is as well as our heart can wish. Their lord is greatly out with them, and that doth also please us well. We have already also a foot in their dish, for our Diabolonian friends are laid in their bosoms. And what do we lack but to be masters of the place? Besides, our trusty friends in Mansoul are daily plotting to betray it to the lords of this town. Also the sickness rages bitterly among them, and that which makes up all, we hope at last to prevail." Then said the dog of Hellgate, "No time like this to assault them. I wish that the enterprise be followed close, and that the success desired may be soon effected. Yea, I wish it for the poor Diabolonians' sake, that live in the continual fear of their lives in that traitorous town of Mansoul." Profane. "The contrivance is almost finished. The lords in Mansoul that are Diabolonians are at it day and night, and the other are like silly doves. They want heart to be concerned with their state, and to consider that ruin is at hand. Besides, you may, yea, must think, when you put all things together, that there are many reasons that prevail with Diabolus to make what haste he can." Cerberus. "Thou hast said as it is. I am glad things are at this pass. Go in, my brave Profane, to my lords. They will give thee for thy welcome as good a coranto as the whole of this kingdom will afford. I have sent thy letter in already." Then Mr. Profane went into the den, and his lord Diabolus met him, and saluted him with, "Welcome, my trusty servant. I have been made glad with thy letter. The rest of the lords of the pit gave him also their salutations. Then Profane, after obeisance made to them all, said, Let man's soul be given to my lord Diabolus, and let him be her king for ever. And with that, the hollow belly and yawning gorge of hell gave so loud and hideous a groan, for that is the music of that place, that it made the mountains about it totter as if they would fall in pieces. Now, after they had read and considered the letter, they consulted what answer to return, and the first that did speak to it was Lucifer. Then said he, The first project of the Dibelonians in man's soul is likely to be lucky, and to take, namely, that they will, by all the ways and means they can, make man's soul yet more vile and filthy. No way to destroy a soul like this. Our old friend Balaam went this way and prospered many years ago. Let this therefore stand with us for a maxim, and be to Dibelonians for a general rule in all ages, for nothing can make this to fail but grace, in which I would hope that this town has no share. But whether to fall upon them on a market day, because of their cumber in business, that I would should be under debate, and there is more reason why this head should be debated, than why some other should, because upon this will turn the whole of what we shall attempt. If we time not our business well, our whole project may fail. Our friends the Dibelonians say that a market day is best, for then will man's soul be most busy and have fewest thoughts of a surprise. But what if also they should double their guards on those days? And methinks nature and reason should teach them to do it. And what if they should keep such a watch on those days as the necessity of their present case doth require? Yea, what if their men should be always in arms in those days? Then you may, my lords, be disappointed in your attempts, and may bring our friends in the town to utter danger of unavoidable ruin. Then said the great Beelzebub, There is something in what my lord hath said, but his conjecture may or may not fall out. Nor hath my lord laid it down as that which must not be receded from, for I know that he said it only to provoke to a warm debate thereabout. Therefore we must understand, if we can, whether the town of Mansoul has such sense and knowledge of her decayed state, and of the design that we have on foot against her, as doth provoke her to set watch and ward at her gates, and to double them on market days. But if, after inquiry made, it shall be found that they are asleep, then any day will do, but a market day is best, and this is my judgment in this case. Then quoth Diabolus, How should we know this? And it was answered, Inquire about it at the mouth of Mr. Profane. So Profane was called in and asked the question, and he made his answer as follows. Profane. My lords, so far as I can gather, this is at present the condition of the town of Mansoul. They are decayed in their faith and love. Emmanuel, their prince, has given them the back. They send often by petition to fetch him again, but he maketh not haste to answer their request, nor is there much reformation among them. Diabolus. I am glad that they are backward in a reformation, but yet I am afraid of their petitioning. However, their looseness of life is a sign that there is not much heart in what they do, and without the heart things are little worth. But go on, my masters, I will divert you, my lords, no longer. Beelzebub. If the case be so with man's soul as Mr. Profane has described it to be, it will be no great matter what day we assault it, not their prayers nor their power will do them much service. When Beelzebub had ended his oration, then Apollyon did begin. My opinion, said he, concerning this matter is, that we can go on fair and softly, not doing things in a hurry. Let our friends in man's soul go on still to pollute and defile it, by seeking to draw it yet more into sin, for there is nothing like sin to devour man's soul. If this be done, and it takes effect, man's soul of itself will leave off to watch, to petition, or anything else that should tend to her security and safety. For she will forget her Emmanuel, she will not desire his company, and can she be gotten thus to live, her prince will not come to her in haste. Our trusty friend, Mr. Carnal Security, with one of his tricks, did drive him out of the town. And why may not my lord Covetousness, my lord Lasciviousness, by what they may do, keep him out of the town. And this I will tell you, not because you know it not, that 2 or 3 Diabolonians, if entertained and countenanced by the town of Mansoul, will do more to the keeping of Emmanuel from them, and towards making the town of Mansoul your own, than can an army of a legion that should be sent out from us to withstand him. Let, therefore, this first project that our friends in Mansoul have set on foot be strongly and diligently carried on, with all cunning and craft imaginable, and let them send continually, under one guise or another, more and other of their men to play with the people of Mansoul. And then perhaps we shall not need to be at the charge of making a war upon them, or if that must of necessity be done, yet the more sinful they are, the more unable, to be sure, they will be to resist us, and then the more easily we shall overcome them. And besides, suppose, and that is the worst that can be supposed, that Emmanuel should come to them again, why may not the same means or the like drive him from them once more? Yea, why may he not, by their lapse into that sin again, be driven from them for ever, for the sake of which he was at the first driven from them for a season? And if this should happen, then away go with him his rams, his slings, his captains, his soldiers, and he leaveth Mansoul naked and bare. Yea, will not this town, when she sees herself utterly forsaken of her prince, of her own accord open her gates again unto you, and make of you as in the days of old? But this must be done by time. A few days will not effect so great a work as this. So soon as Apollyon had made an end of speaking, Diabolus began to blow out his own malice and to plead his own cause, and he said, My lords and powers of the cave, my true and trusty friends, I have with much impatience, as becomes me, given ear to your long and tedious orations. But my furious gorge and empty porch so lusteth after a repossession of my famous town of Mansoul, that whatever comes out, I can wait no longer to see the events of lingering projects. I must, and that without further delay, seek by all means I can to fill my insatiable gulf with the soul and body of the town of Mansoul. Therefore lend me your heads, your hearts, and your help. Now I am going to recover my town of Mansoul. When the lords and princes of the pit saw the flaming desire that was in Diabolus to devour the miserable town of Mansoul, they left off to raise any more objections, but consented to lend him what strength they could, though had Apollyon's advice been taken, they had far more fearfully distressed the town of Mansoul. But, I say, they were willing to lend him what strength they could, not knowing what need they might have of him, when they should engage for themselves as he. Wherefore they fell to advising but the next thing propounded, namely, what soldiers they were, and also how many, with whom Diabolus should go against the town of Mansoul to take it. And after some debate it was concluded, according as in the letter the Diabolonians had suggested, that none were more fit for that expedition than an army of terrible doubters. They therefore concluded to send against Mansoul an army of sturdy doubters. The number thought fit to be employed in that service was between 20 and 30,000. So then the result of that great council of those high and mighty lords was, that Diabolus should even now, out of hand, beat up his drum for men in the land of Doubting, which land lieth upon the confines of the place called Hellgate Hill, for men that might be employed by him against the miserable town of Mansoul. It was also concluded that these lords themselves should help him in the war, and that they would to that end head and manage his men. So they drew up a letter and sent back to the Diabolonians that lurked in Mansoul, and that waited for the back coming of Mr. Profane, to signify to them into what method and forwardness they at present had put their design. The contents were of now follow. From the dark and horrible dungeon of hell, Diabolus, with all the society of the princes of darkness, sends to our trusty ones, in and about the walls of the town of Mansoul, now impatiently waiting for our most devilish answer to their venomous and most poisonous design against the town of Mansoul. Our native ones, in whom from day to day we boast, and in whose actions all the year long we do greatly delight ourselves, we received your welcome, because highly esteemed letter, at the hand of our trusty and greatly beloved, the old gentleman, Mr. Profane. and do give you to understand that when we had broken it up, and had read the contents thereof, to your amazing memory be it spoken, our yawning, hollow-bellied place, where we are, made so hideous and yelling a noise for joy, that the mountains that stand round about Hellgate Hill had like to have been shaken to pieces at the sound thereof. We could also do no less than admire your faithfulness to us, with the greatness of that subtlety that now hath showed itself to be in your heads to serve us against the town of Mansoul. For you have invented for us so excellent a method for our proceeding against that rebellious people, a more effectual cannot be thought of by all the wits of hell. The proposals, therefore, which now at last you have sent us, since we saw them, we have done little else but highly approve and admired them. Nay, we shall, to encourage you in the profundity of your craft, let you know that, at a full assembly and conclave of our princes and principalities of this place, your project was discoursed and tossed from one side of our cave to the other by their mightinesses. But a better, and as was by themselves judged, a more fit and proper way by all their wits, could not be invented, to surprise, take, and make our own the rebellious town of Mansoul. Wherefore, in fine, all that was said that varied from what you had in your letter propounded, fell of itself to the ground, and yours only was stuck to by Diabolus the prince. Yea, his gaping gorge and yawning paunch was on fire to put your invention into execution. We therefore give you to understand that our stout, furious, and unmerciful Diabolus is raising, for your relief, and the ruin of the rebellious town of Mansoul, more than 20,000 doubters to come against that people. They are all stout and sturdy men, and men that of old have been accustomed to war, and that can therefore well endure the drum. I say, he is doing this work of his with all the possible speed he can, for his heart and spirit is engaged in it. We desire, therefore, that, as you have hitherto stuck to us, and given us both advice and encouragement thus far, you still will prosecute our design. Nor shall you lose, but be gainers thereby. Yea, we intend to make you the lords of Mansoul. One thing may not by any means be omitted, that is, those with us do desire that every one of you that are in Mansoul would still use all your power, cunning, and skill, with delusive persuasions, yet to draw the town of Mansoul into more sin and wickedness, even that sin may be finished and bring forth death. For thus it is concluded with us that the more vile, sinful, and debauched the town of Mansoul is, more backward will be their Emmanuel to come to their help, either by presence or other relief. Yea, the more sinful, the more weak, and so the more unable will they be to make resistance when we shall make our assault upon them to swallow them up. Yea, that may cause that their mighty Shaddai himself may cast them out of his protection. Yea, and send for his captains and soldiers home with his slings and rams, and leave them naked and bare. And then the town of Mansoul will of itself open to us, and fall as the fig into the mouth of the eater. Yea, to be sure that we then with a great deal of ease shall come upon her and overcome her. As the time of our coming upon Mansoul, we as yet have not fully resolved upon that, though at present some of us think as you, that a market day, or a market day at night, will certainly be the best. However, do you be ready, and when you shall hear our roaring drum without, do you be as busy to make the most horrible confusion within. So shall Mansoul certainly be distressed before and behind, and shall not know which way to betake herself for help. My lord Lucifer, my lord Beelzebub, my lord Apollyon, my lord Legion, with the rest, salute you, as does also my lord Diabolus. We wish both you, with all that you do or shall possess, the very self-same fruit and success for their doing as we ourselves at present enjoy for ourselves. From our dreadful confines in the most fearful pit, we salute you, and so do those many legions here with us, wishing you may be as hellishly prosperous as we desire to be ourselves. By the letter carrier, Mr. Profane. Then Mr. Profane addressed himself for his return to Mansoul, with his errand from the horrible pit to the Diabolonians that dwelt in that town. So he came up the stairs from the deep to the mouth of the cave where Cerberus was. Now when Cerberus saw him, he asked how did matters go below, about and against the town of Mansoul. Profane. Things go as well as we can expect. The letter that I carried thither was highly approved, and well liked by all my lords, and I am returning to tell our Dibelonians so. I have an answer to it here in my bosom, that I am sure will make our masters that sent me glad, for the contents thereof are to encourage them to pursue their design to the utmost, and to be ready also to fall on within, when they shall see my lord Diabolus beleaguering the town of Mansoul. Cerberus. But does he intend to go against them himself? Profane. Does he? Ay, and he will take along with him more than 20,000, all sturdy doubters and men of war, picked men from the land of doubting, to serve him in the expedition. Then was Cerberus glad, and said, And is there such brave preparations a making to go against the miserable town of Mansoul? And would I might be put at the head of 1,000 of them, that I might also show my valour against the famous town of Mansoul. Profane. Your wish may come to pass. You look like one that has mettle enough, and my lord will have with him those that are valiant and stout. But my business requires haste. Cerberus. Ay, so it does. Speed thee to the town of Mansoul, with all the deepest mischiefs that this place can afford thee. And when thou shalt come to the house of Mr. Mischief, the place where the Dibelonians meet to plot, tell them that Cerberus doth wish them his service, and that if he may, he will with the army come up against the famous town of Mansoul. Profane. That I will, and I know that my lords that are there will be glad to hear it, and to see you also. So after a few more such kind of compliments, Mr. Profane took his leave of his friend Cerberus. And Cerberus again with 1,000 of their pit wishers bid him haste with all speed to his masters, the which when he had heard, he made obeisance, and began to gather up his heels to run. Thus therefore he returned, and went and came to Mansoul, and going as afore to the house of Mr. Mischief, there he found the Dibelonians assembled, and waiting for his return. Now when he was come and had presented himself, he also delivered to them his letter, and adjoined this compliment to them therewith. My lords, from the confines of the pit, the high and mighty principalities and powers of the den salute you here, the true Dibelonians of the town of Mansoul, wishing you always the most proper of their benedictions for the great service, high attempts, and brave achievements that you have put yourselves upon for the restoring to our Prince Diabolus the famous town of Mansoul. This was therefore the present state of the miserable town of Mansoul. She had offended her prince, and he was gone. She had encouraged the powers of hell by her foolishness to come against her, to seek her utter destruction. True, the town of Mansoul was somewhat made sensible of her sin, but the Dibelonians were gotten into her bowels. She cried, but Emmanuel was gone, and her cries did not fetch him as yet again. Besides, she knew not now whether, ever or never, he would return and come to his Mansoul again, nor did they know the power and industry of the enemy, nor how forward they were put in execution that plot of hell that they had devised against her. They did indeed still send petition after petition to the prince, but he answered all with silence. They did neglect reformation, and that was as Diabolus would have it, for he knew if they regarded iniquity in their heart, their king would not hear their prayer. They therefore did still grow weaker and weaker, and were as a rolling thing before the whirlwind. They cried to their king for help, and laid Dibelonians in their bosoms. What therefore should a king do to them? Yea, they seemed now to be a mixture in Mansoul. The Dibelonians and Mansoulians would walk the streets together. Yea, they began to seek their peace, for they thought that, since the sickness had been so mortal in Mansoul, it was in vain to go to handicrafts with them. Besides, the weakness of Mansoul was the strength of her enemies, and the sins of Mansoul the advantage of the Dibelonians. The foes of Mansoul did also now begin to promise themselves the town for a possession. There was no great difference now betwixt Mansoulians and Dibelonians. Both seemed to be masters of Mansoul. Yea, the Dibelonians increased and grew, but the town of Mansoul diminished greatly. There were more than 11,000 men, women, and children that died by the sickness in Mansoul. But now, as Shaddai would have it, there was one whose name was Mr. Prywell, a great lover of the people of Mansoul. And he, as his manner was, did go listening up and down in man's soul, to see and to hear, if at any time he might, whether there was any design against it or no. For he was always a jealous man, and feared some mischief sometime would befall it, either from the Dibelonians within, or from some power without. Now upon a time it so happened, as Mr. Prywell went listening here and there, that he lighted upon a place called Vile Hill in Man's Soul, where Dibelonians used to meet. So hearing a muttering, you must know that it was in the night, he softly drew near to hear. Nor had he stood long under the house end, for there stood a house there, but he heard one confidently affirm that it was not, or would not be long, before Diabolus should possess himself again of man's soul, and that then the Dibelonians did intend to put all Mansolians to the sword, and would kill and destroy the king's captains, and drive all his soldiers out of the town. He said moreover that he knew there were above 20,000 fighting men prepared by Diabolus for the accomplishing of this design, and that it would not be months before they all should see it. When Mr. Prywell had heard this story, he did quickly believe it was true. Wherefore he went forthwith to my Lord Mayor's house, and acquainted him therewith, who, sending for the subordinate preacher, brake the business to him, and he as soon gave the alarm to the town, for he was now the chief preacher in Man's Soul, because as yet my Lord Secretary was ill at ease. And this was the way that the subordinate preacher did take to alarm the town therewith. The same hour he caused the lecture bell to be rung. So the people came together. He gave them then a short exhortation to watchfulness, and made Mr. Prywell's news the argument thereof. For, said he, an horrible plot is contrived against man's soul, even to massacre us all in a day. Nor is this story to be slighted, for Mr. Prywell is the author thereof. Mr. Prywell was always a lover of man's soul, a sober and judicious man, a man that is no tattler, nor raiser of false reports, but one that loves to look into the very bottom of matters, and talks nothing of news, but by very solid arguments. I will call him, and you shall hear him your own selves. So he called him, and he came and told his tale so punctually, and affirmed its truth with such ample grounds, that man's soul fell presently under a conviction of the truth of what he said. The preacher did also back him, saying, Sirs, it is not irrational for us to believe it, for we have provoked Shaddai to anger, and have sinned Emmanuel out of the town. We have had too much correspondence with Dibelonians, and have forsaken our former mercies. No marvel then if the enemy both within and without should design and plot our ruin. And what time like this to do it? The sickness is now in the town, and we have been made weak thereby. Many a good-meaning man is dead, and the Dibelonians of late grow stronger and stronger. Besides, quoth the subordinate preacher, I have received from this good truth-teller this one inkling further, that he understood by those that he overheard that several letters have lately passed between the Furies and the Dibelonians in order to our destruction. When man's soul heard all this, and not being able to gainsay it, they lift up their voice and wept. Mr. Prywell did also, in the presence of the townsmen, confirm all that their subordinate preacher had said. Wherefore they now set afresh to bewail their folly, and to a doubling of petitions to Shaddai and his son. They also brake the business to the captains, high commanders, and men of war in the town of Man's Soul, entreating them to use the means to be strong, and to take courage, and that they themselves would look after their harness, and make themselves ready to give Diabolus battle by day and by night, shall he come, as they are informed he will, to beleaguer the town of Man's Soul. When the captains heard this, they being always true lovers of the town of Man's Soul, what do they but, like so many Samsons, they shake themselves, and come together to consult and contrive how to defeat those bold and hellish contrivances that were upon the wheel by the means of Diabolus and his friends against the now sickly, weakly, and much impoverished town of Man's Soul. And they agreed upon these following particulars. 1. That the gates of Man's Soul should be kept shut, and made fast with bars and locks, and that all persons that went out or came in should be very strictly examined by the captains of the guards, to the end, said they, that those that are managers of the plot amongst us may, either coming or going, be taken, and that we may also find out who are the great contrivers amongst us of our ruin. 2. The next thing was that a strict search should be made for all kind of Dibelonians throughout the whole town of Man's Soul, and that every man's house from top to bottom should be looked into, and that too, house by house, that if possible a further discovery might be made of all such among them as had a hand in these designs. 3. It was further concluded upon, that wheresoever or with whomsoever any of the Dibelonians were found, that even those of the town of Mansoul that had given them house and harbour should, to their shame and the warning of others, take penance in the open place. 4. It was, moreover, resolved by the famous town of Mansoul that a public fast and a day of humiliation should be kept throughout the whole corporation, to the justifying of their prince, the abasing of themselves before him for their transgressions against him and against Shaddai his father. It was further resolved that all such in Mansoul as did not on that day endeavour to keep that fast, and to humble themselves for their faults, but that should mind their worldly employs, or be found wandering up and down the streets, should be taken for Dibelonians, and should suffer as Dibelonians for such their wicked doings. 5. It was further concluded then that with what speed and with what warmth of mind they could, they would renew their humiliation for sin and their petitions to Shaddai for help. They also resolved to send tidings to the court of all that Mr. Prywell had told them. 6. It was also determined that thanks should be given by the town of Mansoul to Mr. Prywell for his diligent seeking of the welfare of their town, and further, that forasmuch as he was so naturally inclined to seek their good, and also to undermine their foes, they gave him a commission of Scoutmaster General for the good of the town of Mansoul. When the corporation with their captains had thus concluded, they did as they had said. They shut up their gates, they made for Dibelonians strict search, they made for those with whom any were found to take penance in the open place. They kept their fast, and renewed their petitions to their prince. And Mr. Prywell managed his charge and the trust that Mansoul had put in his hands with great conscience and good fidelity. For he gave himself wholly up to his employ, and that not only within the town, but he went out to pry, to see, and to hear. End of chapter 12. Of the Holy War. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Joy Chan. The Holy War by John Bunyan. Chapter 13. And not many days after he provided for his journey and went towards Hellgate Hill, into the country where the doubters were, where he heard of all that had been talked of in Mansoul, and he perceived also that Diabolus was almost ready for his march, etc. So he came back with speed, and, calling the captains and elders of Mansoul together, he told them where he had been, what he had heard, and what he had seen. Particularly, he told them that Diabolus was almost ready for his march, and that he had made old Mr. Incredulity, that once brake prison in Mansoul, the general of his army, that his army consisted all of doubters, and that their number was above 20,000. He told, moreover, that Diabolus did intend to bring with him the chief princes of the infernal pit, and that he would make them chief captains over his doubters. He told them, moreover, that it was certainly true that several of the black den would, with Diabolus, ride reformades to reduce the town of Mansoul to the obedience of Diabolus their prince. He said, moreover, that he understood by the doubters, among whom he had been, that the reason why old Incredulity was made general of the whole army was because none truer than he to the tyrant, and because he had an implacable spite against the welfare of the town of Mansoul. Besides, said he remembers the affronts that Mansoul has given him, and he is resolved to be revenged of them. But the black princes shall be made high commanders, only Incredulity shall be over them all, because, which I had almost forgot, he can more easily and more dexterously beleaguer the town of Mansoul than can any of the princes besides. Now when the captains of Mansoul, with the elders of the town, had heard the tidings that Mr. Prywell did bring, they thought it expedient, without further delay, to put into execution the laws that against the Dibelonians their prince had made for them, and given them in commandment to manage against them. Wherefore forthwith a diligent and impartial search was made in all houses in Mansoul, for all and all manner of Dibelonians. Now in the house of Mr. Mind and in the house of the great lord Wilbywill were 2 Dibelonians found. In Mr. Mind's house was one Lord Covetousness found, but he had changed his name to Prudent Thrifty. In my Lord Wilbywill's house one Lasciviousness was found, but he had changed his name to Harmless Mirth. These 2 the captains and elders of the town of Mansoul took and committed them to custody under the hand of Mr. Trueman the jailor. This man handled them so severely, and loaded them so well with irons, that in time they both fell into a very deep consumption, and died in the prison-house. Their masters also, according to the agreement of the captains and elders, were brought to take penance in the open place, to their shame, and for a warning to the rest of the town of Mansoul. Now this was the manner of penance in those days. The persons offending, being made sensible of the evil of their doings, were enjoined upon confession of their faults and a strict amendment of their lives. After this the captains and elders of Mansoul sought yet to find out more Dibelonians wherever they lurked, whether in dens, caves, holes, vaults, or where else they could, in or about the wall or town of Mansoul. But though they could plainly see their footing, and so follow them by their track and smell to their holds, even to the mouths of their caves and dens, yet take them, hold them, and do justice upon them, they could not. Their ways were so crooked, their holds so strong, and they so quick to take sanctuary there. But Mansoul did now with so stiff an hand rule over the Dibelonians that were left, that they were glad to shrink into corners. Time was when they durst walk openly and in the day, but now they were forced to embrace privacy and the night. Time was when a Mansoulian was their companion, but now they counted them deadly enemies. This good change did Mr. Prywell's intelligence make in the famous town of Mansoul. By this time Diabolus had finished his army, which he intended to bring with him for the ruin of Mansoul, and had set over them captains and other field officers, such as liked his furious stomach best. Himself was lord paramount. Incredulity was general of his army. The highest captains shall be named afterwards, but now for their officers' colours and scutcheons. 1. Their first captain was Captain Rage. He was captain over the election doubters. His were the red colours. His standard-bearer was Mr. Destructive, and the great red dragon he had for a scutcheon. 2. The second captain was Captain Fury. He was captain over the vocation doubters. His standard-bearer was Mr. Darkness. His colours were those that were pale, and he had for a scutcheon the fiery flying serpent. 3. The third captain was Captain Damnation. He was captain over the grace doubters. His were the red colours. Mr. No Life bare them, and he had for a scutcheon the black den. 4. The fourth captain was Captain Insatiable. He was captain over the faith doubters. His were the red colours. Mr. Devourer bare them, and he had for a scutcheon the yawning jaws. 5. The fifth captain was Captain Brimstone. He was captain over the perseverance doubters. His also were the red colours. Mr. Burning bare them, and his scutcheon was the blue and stinking flame. 6. The sixth captain was Captain Torment. He was captain over the resurrection doubters. His colours were those that were pale. Mr. Gnaw was his standard-bearer, and he had the black worm for a scutcheon. 7. The seventh captain was Captain No Ease. He was captain over the salvation doubters. His were the red colours. Mr. Restless bare them, and his scutcheon was the ghastly picture of death. 8. The eighth captain was the Captain Sepulchre. He was captain over the glory doubters. His also were the pale colours. Mr. Corruption was his standard-bearer, and he had for a scutcheon a skull and dead men's bones. 9. The ninth captain was Captain Past Hope. He was captain of those that are called the Felicity doubters. His standard-bearer was Mr. Despair. His also were the red colours, and his scutcheon was a hot iron and the hard heart. These were his captains, and these were their forces. These were their standards, these were their colours, and these were their scutcheons. Now over these did the great Diabolus make superior captains, and they were in number 7, as namely, the Lord Beelzebub, the Lord Lucifer, the Lord Legion, the Lord Apollyon, the Lord Python, the Lord Cerberus, and the Lord Belial. These 7 he set over the captains, and Incredulity was Lord General, and Diabolus was king. The Reformades also, such as were like themselves, were made some of them captains of hundreds, and some of them captains of more. And thus were the army of incredulity completed. So they set out at Hellgate Hill, for there they had their rendezvous, from whence they came with a straight course upon their march toward the town of Mansoul. Now, as was hinted before, the town had, as Shaddai would have it, received from the mouth of Mr. Prywell the alarm of their coming before. Wherefore they set a strong watch at the gates, and had also doubled their guards. They also mounted their slings in good places, where they might conveniently cast out their great stones to the annoyance of their furious enemy. Nor could those Dibelonians that were in the town do that hurt as was designed they should, for Mansoul was now awake. But alas, poor people! They were sorely affrighted at the first appearance of their foes, and at their sitting down before the town, especially when they heard the roaring of their drum. This, to speak truth, was amazingly hideous to hear. It frighted all men 7 miles round, if they were but awake and heard it. The streaming of their colours was also terrible and dejecting to behold. When Diabolus was come up against the town, first he made his approach to Eargate, and gave it a furious assault, supposing, as it seems, that his friends in Mansoul had been ready to do the work within. But care was taken of that before, by the vigilance of the captains. Wherefore, missing of the help that he expected from them, and finding his army warmly attended with the stones that the slingers did sling. For that I will say for the captains, that considering the weakness that yet was upon them by reason of the long sickness that had annoyed the town of Mansoul, they did gallantly behave themselves. He was forced to make some retreat from Mansoul, and to entrench himself and his men in the field without the reach of the slings of the town. Now, having entrenched himself, he did cast up 4 mounts against the town. The first he called Mount Diabolus, putting his own name thereon, the more to affright the town of Mansoul. The other 3 he called thus, Mount Electo, Mount Megara, and Mount Tisiphone, for these are the names of the dreadful furies of hell. Thus he began to play his game with Mansoul, and to serve it as doth the lion his prey, even to make it fall before his terror. But, as I said, the captains and soldiers resisted so stoutly, and did do such execution with their stones, that they made him, though against stomach, to retreat, wherefore Mansoul began to take courage. Now upon Mount Diabolus, which was raised on the north side of the town, there did the tyrant set up his standard, and a fearful thing it was to behold, for he had wrought in it by devilish art, after the manner of Vescutian, a flaming flame, fearful to behold, and the picture of Mansoul burning in it. When Diabolus had thus done, he commanded that his drummer should every night approach the walls of the town of Mansoul, and so to beat a parley. The command was to do it at nights, for in the daytime they annoyed him with their slings. For the tyrant said that he had a mind to parley with the now trembling town of Mansoul, and he commanded that the drums should beat every night, that through weariness they might at last, if possible, at the first they were unwilling yet, be forced to do it. So this drummer did as commanded. He arose and did beat his drum. But when his drum did go, if one looked toward the town of Mansoul, behold darkness and sorrow, and the light was darkened in the heaven thereof. No noise was ever heard upon earth more terrible, except the voice of Shaddai when he speaketh. But how did Mansoul tremble! It now looked for nothing but forthwith to be swallowed up. When this drummer had beaten for a parley, he made this speech to Mansoul: My master has bid me tell you, that if you will willingly submit, you shall have the good of the earth, but if you shall be stubborn, he is resolved to take you by force. But by that the fugitive had done beating his drum, the people of Mansoul had betaken themselves to the captains that were in the castle, so that there was none to regard, nor to give this drummer an answer. So he proceeded no further that night, but returned again to his master to the camp. When Diabolus saw that by drumming he could not work out Mansoul to his will, the next night he sendeth his drummer without his drum, still to let the townsmen know that he had a mind to parley with them. But when all came to all, his parley was turned into a summons to the town to deliver up themselves. But they gave him neither heed nor hearing, for they remembered what at first it cost them to hear him a few words. The next night he sends again, and then who should be his messenger to Mansoul but the terrible Captain Sepulchre. So Captain Sepulchre came up to the walls of Mansoul, and made this oration to the town. O ye inhabitants of the rebellious town of Mansoul, I summon you in the name of the Prince Diabolus, that, without any more ado, you set open the gates of your town, and admit the great lord to come in. But if you shall still rebel, when we have taken to us the town by force, we will swallow you up as the grave. Wherefore, if you will hearken to my summons, say so, and if not, then let me know. The reason of this my summons, quoth he, is for that my lord is your undoubted prince and lord, as you yourselves have formerly owned. Nor shall that assault that was given to my lord, when Emmanuel dealt so dishonourably by him, prevail with him to lose his right, and to forbear to attempt to recover his own. Consider then, O Mansoul, with thyself, wilt thou show thyself peaceable, or no? If thou shalt quietly yield up thyself, then our old friendship shall be renewed. But if thou shalt yet refuse and rebel, then expect nothing but fire and sword. When the languishing town of Mansoul had heard this summoner and his summons, they were yet more put to their dunce, but made to the captain no answer at all. So away he went as he came. But after some consultation among themselves, as also with some of their captains, they applied themselves afresh to the Lord Secretary for counsel and advice from him. For this Lord Secretary was their chief preacher, as also is mentioned some pages before. Only now he was ill at ease, and of him they begged favour in these 2 or 3 things. 1, that he would look comfortably upon them, and not keep himself so much retired from them as formerly. Also that he would be prevailed with to give them a hearing, while they should make known their miserable condition to him. But to this he told them as before, that as yet he was but ill at ease, and therefore could not do as he had formerly done. 2. The second thing that they desired was, that he would be pleased to give them his advice about their now so important affairs, for that Diabolus was come and set down before the town with no less than 20,000 doubters. They said moreover that both he and his captains were cruel men, and that they were afraid of them. But to this he said, You must look to the law of the prince, and there see what is laid upon you to do. 3. Then they desired that his highness would help them to frame a petition to Shaddai, and unto Emmanuel his son, and that he would set his own hand thereto as a token that he was one with them in it. For, said they, My lord, many a one have we sent, but can get no answer of peace. But now, surely, one with thy hand unto it may obtain good for man's soul. But all the answer that he gave to this was, that they had offended their Emmanuel, and had also grieved him, and that therefore they must as yet partake of their own devices. This answer of the Lord Secretary fell like a millstone upon them. Yea, it crushed them so, that they could not tell what to do. Yet they durst not comply with the demands of Diabolus, nor with the demands of his captain. So then here were the straits that the town of Mansoul was betwixt, when the enemy came upon her. Her foes were ready to swallow her up, and her friends did forbear to help her. Then stood up my Lord Mayor, whose name was my Lord Understanding, and he began to pick, until he had picked comfort out of that seemingly bitter saying of the Lord Secretary, for thus he descanted upon it. First, said he, this unavoidably follows upon the saying of my lord, that we must yet suffer for our sins. Secondly, but, quoth he, the words yet sound as if at last we should be saved from our enemies, and that after a few more sorrows Emmanuel will come and be our help. Now the Lord Mayor was the more critical in his dealing with the secretary's words, because my lord was much more than a prophet, and because none of his words were such, but that at all times they were most exactly significant. And the townsmen were allowed to pry into them, and to expound them to their best advantage. So they took their leaves of my lord, and returned, and went and came to the captains, to whom they did tell what my lord High Secretary had said, who, when they had heard it, were all of the same opinion as was my Lord Mayor himself. The captains therefore began to take some courage unto them, and to prepare to make some brave attempt upon the camp of the enemy, and to destroy all that were Diabolonians, with the roving doubters that the tyrant had brought with him to destroy the poor town of Mansoul. So all betook themselves forthwith to their places, the captains to theirs, the Lord Mayor to his, the subordinate preacher to his, and my Lord Will-be-will to his. The captains longed to be at some work for their prince, for they delighted in warlike achievements. The next day, therefore, they came together and consulted, and after consultation they resolved to give an answer to the captain of Diabolus with slings, and so they did at the rising of the sun on the morrow. For Diabolus had adventured to come nearer again, but the sling-stones were to him in his like hornets. For as there is nothing to the town of Mansoul so terrible as the roaring of Diabolus's drum, so there is nothing to Diabolus so terrible as the well-playing of Emmanuel's slings. Wherefore Diabolus was forced to make another retreat, yet farther off from the famous town of Mansoul. Then did the Lord Mayor of Mansoul cause the bells to be rung, and that thanks should be sent to the Lord High Secretary by the mouth of the subordinate preacher, for that by his words the captains and elders of Mansoul had been strengthened against Diabolus. When Diabolus saw that his captains and soldiers, high lords and renowned, were frightened, and beaten down by the stones that came from the golden slings of the prince of the town of Mansoul, he bethought himself and said, I will try to catch them by fawning. I will try to flatter them into my net. Wherefore after a while he came down again to the wall, not now with his drum, nor with Captain Sepulchre, but having all besugared his lips, he seemed to be a very sweet-mouthed, peaceable prince, designing nothing for humour's sake, nor to be revenged on Mansoul for injuries by them done to him. But the welfare and good and advantage of the town and people therein was now, as he said, his only design. Wherefore after he had called for audience, and desired that the townsfolk would give it to him, he proceeded in his oration, and said, O the desire of my heart, the famous town of Mansoul! How many nights have I watched, and how many weary steps have I taken, if perhaps I might do thee good! Far be it from me to desire to make a war upon you, if ye will but willingly and quietly deliver up yourselves unto me. You know that you were mine of old. Remember also that so long as you enjoyed me for your lord, that I enjoyed you for my subjects. You wanted for nothing of all the delights of the earth that I, your lord and prince, could get for you, or that I could invent to make you bonny and blithe withal. Consider, you never had so many hard, dark, troublesome, and heart-afflicting hours while you were mine, as you have had since you revolted from me. Nor shall you ever have peace again until you and I become one as before. But be but prevailed with to embrace me again, and I will grant, yea, enlarge your old charter with abundance of privileges, so that your licence and liberty shall be to take, hold, enjoy, and make your own all that is pleasant from the east to the west. Nor shall any of those incivilities wherewith you have offended me be ever charged upon you by me, so long as the sun and moon endure. Nor shall any of those dear friends of mine that now, for the fear of you, lie lurking in dens and holes and caves in Mansoul, be hurtful to you any more. Yea, they shall be your servants, and shall minister unto you of their substance, and of whatever shall come to hand. I need speak no more. You know them, and have some time since been much delighted in their company. Why then should we abide at such odds? Let us renew our old acquaintance and friendship again. Bear with your friend. I take the liberty at this time to speak thus freely unto you. The love that I have to you presses me to do it, as also does the zeal of my heart for my friends with you. Put me not therefore to further trouble, nor yourselves to further fears and frights. Have you, I will, in the way of peace or war. Nor do you flatter yourselves with the power and force of your captains, or that your Emmanuel will shortly come in to your help, for such strength will do you no pleasure. I am come against you with a stout and valiant army, and all the chief princes of the Den are even at the head of it. Besides, my captains are swifter than eagles, stronger than lions, and more greedy of prey than are the evening wolves. What is Og of Bashan? What is Goliath of Gath? And what are 100 more of them to one of the least of my captains? How then shall Mansoul think to escape my hand and force? Diabolus, having thus ended his flattery, fawning, deceitful, and lying speech to the famous town of Mansoul, the Lord Mayor replied to him as follows: O Diabolus, prince of darkness, and master of all deceit, thy lying flatteries we have had and made sufficient probation of, and have tasted too deeply of that destructive cup already. Should we therefore again hearken unto thee, and so break the commandments of our great Shaddai, to join in affinity with thee, Will not our prince reject us, and cast us off for ever? And, being cast off by him, can the place that he has prepared for thee be a place of rest for us? Besides, O thou that art empty and void of all truth, we are rather ready to die by thy hand than to fall in with thy flattering and lying deceits. When the tyrant saw that there was little to be got by parleying with my lord mayor, he fell into an hellish rage, and resolved that again, with his army of doubters, he would another time assault the town of Mansoul. So he called for his drummer, who beat up for his men, and while he did beat, Mansoul did shake, to be in a readiness to give battle to the corporation. Then Diabolus drew near with his army, and thus disposed of his men. Captain Cruel and Captain Torment, these he drew up and placed against Fieldgate, and commanded them to sit down there for the war. And he also appointed that, if need were, Captain No Ease should come in to their relief. At Nosegate he placed the Captain Brimstone and Captain Sepulchre, and bid them look well to their ward on that side of the town of Mansoul. But at Eyegate he placed that grim-faced one, the Captain Past Hope, and there also now he did set up his terrible standard. Now Captain Insatiable, he was to look to the carriages of Diabolus, and was also appointed to take into custody that, or those persons and things, that should at any time as prey be taken from the enemy. Now Mouthgate the inhabitants of Mansoul kept for a sally-port, wherefore that they kept strong, for that was it bide out at which the townsfolk did send their petitions to Emmanuel their prince. That also was the gate from the top of which the captains did play their slings at the enemies, for that gate stood somewhat ascending, so that the placing of them there, and the letting of them fly from that place, did much execution against the tyrant's army. Wherefore for these causes with others Diabolus sought, if possible, to land up Mouthgate with dirt. End of chapter 13. Of the Holy War. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Joy Chan. The Holy War by John Bunyan. Chapter 14. Now as Diabolus was busy and industrious in preparing to make his assault upon the town of Mansoul without, so the captains and soldiers in the corporation were as busy in preparing within. They mounted their slings, they set up their banners, they sounded their trumpets, and put themselves in such order as was judged most for the annoyance of the enemy, and for the advantage of Mansoul, and gave to their soldiers orders to be ready at the sound of the trumpet for war. The Lord Will-be-will also, he took the charge of watching against the rebels within, and to do what he could to take them while without, or to stifle them within their caves, dens, and holes in the town wall of Mansoul. And, to speak the truth of him, ever since he took penance for his fault, he was showed as much honesty and bravery of spirit as any he in Mansoul. For he took one Jolly, and his brother Grigish, the two sons of his servant Harmless Mirth. For to that day, though the father was committed to ward, the sons had a dwelling in the house of my lord. I say, he took them, and with his own hands put them to the cross. And this was the reason why he hanged them up. After their father was put into the hands of Mr. Trueman the jailor, they, his sons, began to play his pranks, and to be ticking and toying with the daughters of their lord. Nay, it was jealous that they were too familiar with them, the which was brought to his lordship's ear. Now his lordship, being unwillingly advisedly to put any man to death, did not suddenly fall upon them, but set watch and spies to see if the thing was true. Of the which he was soon informed, for his two servants, whose names were Find Out and Tell All, catched them together in uncivil manner more than once or twice, and went and told their lord. So when my lord Will-be-will had sufficient ground to believe the thing was true, he takes the two young Dibelonians, for such they were, for their father was a Dibelonian born, and has them to Eyegate, where he raised a very high cross, just in the face of Diabolus and of his army, and there he hanged the young villains, in defiance to Captain Past Hope and of the horrible standard of the tyrant. Now this Christian act of the brave Lord Wilby-will did greatly abash Captain Past Hope, discouraged the army of Diabolus, put fear into the Diabolonian runagates in man's soul, and put strength and courage into the captains that belonged to Emmanuel the Prince. For they without did gather, and that by this very act of my lord, that man's soul was resolved to fight, and that the Diabolonians within the town could not do such things as Diabolus had hopes they would. Nor was this the only proof of the brave Lord Wilby-will's honesty to the town, nor of his loyalty to his prince, as will afterwards appear. Now when the children of prudent Thrifty, who dwelt with Mr. Mind, for Thrift left children with Mr. Mind when he was also committed to prison, and their names were Gripe and Raycall. These he begat of Mr. Mind's bastard daughter, whose name was Mrs. Holdfast Bad. I say, when his children perceived how the Lord Wilby-will had served them that dwelt with him, what did they but, lest they should drink of the same cup, endeavour to make their escape? But Mr. Mind, being wary of it, took them and put them in hold in his house till morning, for this was done overnight. And remembering that by the law of man's soul all Diabolonians were to die, and to be sure they were at least by his father's side such, and some say by his mother's side too, what does he but takes them and puts them in chains, and carries them to the self-same place where my lord hanged his two before, and there he hanged them. The townsmen also took great encouragement at this act of Mr. Mind, and did what they could to have taken some more of these Diabolonian troublers of man's soul. But at that time the rest lay so squat and close that they could not be apprehended. So they set against them a diligent watch, and went every man to his place. I told you a little before that Diabolus and his army were somewhat abashed and discouraged at the sight of what my lord Wilby-will did, when he hanged up those two young Diabolonians. But his discouragement quickly turned itself into furious madness and rage against the town of man's soul, and fight it he would. Also the townsmen and captains within, they had their hopes and their expectations heightened, believing at last the day would be theirs, so they feared them the less. Their subordinate preacher too made a sermon about it, and he took that theme for his text. Gad, a troop shall overcome him, but he shall overcome at the last. Whence he showed that though man's soul should be sorely put to it at the first, yet the victory should most certainly be man's soul's at the last. So Diabolus commanded that his drummer should beat a charge against the town, and the captains also that were in the town sounded a charge against them, but they had no drum. They were trumpets of silver with which they sounded against them. Then they which were of the camp of Diabolus came down to the town to take it, and the captains in the castle, with the slingers at Mouth Gate, played upon them amain. And now there was nothing heard in the camp of Diabolus but horrible rage and blasphemy, but in the town good words, prayer, and singing of psalms. The enemy replied with horrible objections, and the terribleness of their drum. But the town made answer with the slapping of their slings and the melodious noise of their trumpets. And thus the fight lasted for several days together, only now and then they had some small intermission, in the which the townsmen refreshed themselves, and the captains made ready for another assault. The captains of Emmanuel were clad in silver armour, and the soldiers in that which was of proof, the soldiers of Diabolus, were clad in iron which was made to give place to Emmanuel's engine shot. In the town some were hurt, and some were greatly wounded. Now the worst of it was, a chirurgeon was scarce in man's soul, for that Emmanuel at present was absent. Howbeit with the leaves of a tree the wounded were kept from dying, yet their wounds did greatly putrefy, and some did grievously stink. Of the townsmen these were wounded, namely, my lord Reason, he was wounded in the head. Another that was wounded was the brave Lord Mayor, he was wounded in the eye. Another that was wounded was Mr. Mind, he received his wound about the stomach. The honest subordinate preacher also, he received a shot not far off the heart, but none of these were mortal. Many also of the inferior sort were not only wounded, but slain outright. Now in the camp of Diabolus were wounded and slain a considerable number. For instance, Captain Rage, he was wounded, and so was Captain Cruel. Captain Damnation was made to retreat, and to entrench himself farther off of man's soul. The standard also of Diabolus was beaten down, and his standard-bearer, Captain Much hurt, had his brains beat out with a sling-stone, to the no little grief and shame of his prince Diabolus. Many also of the doubters were slain outright, though enough of them were left alive to make man's soul shake and totter. Now the victory that day being turned to man's soul, did put great valour into the townsmen and captains, and did cover Diabolus's camp with a cloud, but withal it made them far more furious. So the next day man's soul rested, and commanded that the bells should be rung. The trumpets also joyfully sounded, and the captains shouted round the town. My lord Will-be-will also was not idle, but did notable service within against the domestics, or the Dibelonians that were in the town, not only by keeping them in awe, for he lighted on one at last, whose name was Mr. Anything, a fellow of whom mention was made before. For it was he, if you remember, that brought the 3 fellows to Diabolus, whom the Dibelonians took out of Captain Boanerges' companies, and that persuaded them to list themselves under the tyrant, to fight against the army of Shaddai. My lord Will-be-will did also take a notable Dibelonian, whose name was Loosefoot. This Loosefoot was a scout to the vagabonds in Mansoul, and did use to carry tidings out of Mansoul to the camp, and out of the camp to those of the enemies in Mansoul. But these my lord sent away safe to Mr. Trueman the jailor, with a commandment to keep them in irons, for he intended then to have them out to be crucified, when it would be for the best to the corporation, and most for the discouragement of the camp of the enemies. My lord Mayor also, though he could not stir about so much as formerly because of the wound that he lately received, yet gave he out orders to all that were the natives of Mansoul to look to their watch and stand upon their guard, and, as occasion should offer, to prove themselves men. Mr. Conscience, the preacher, he also did his utmost to keep all his good documents alive upon the hearts of the people of Mansoul. Well, a while after, the captains and stout ones of the town of Mansoul agreed and resolved upon a time to make a sally out upon the camp of Diabolus, and this must be done in the night. And there was the folly of Mansoul, for the night is always the best for the enemy, but the worst for Mansoul to fight in. But yet they would do it, their courage was so high. Their last victory also still stuck in their memories. So the night appointed being come, the prince's brave captains cast lots who should lead the van in this new and desperate expedition against Diabolus, and against his Dibelonian army. And the lot fell to Captain Credence, to Captain Experience, and to Captain Goodhope, to lead the forlorn hope. This Captain Experience the prince created such when himself did reside in the town of Mansoul. So, as I said, they made their sally out upon the army that lay in the siege against them, and their hap was to fall in with the main body of their enemies. Now Diabolus and his men, being expertly accustomed to night work, took the alarm presently, and were as ready to give them battle, as if they had sent them word of their coming. Wherefore to it they went amain, and blows were hard on every side. The hell-drum also was beat most furiously, while the trumpets of the prince most sweetly sounded. And thus the battle was joined, and Captain Insatiable looked to the enemy's carriages, and waited when he should receive some prey. The prince's captains fought it stoutly, beyond what indeed could be expected they should. They wounded many. They made the whole army of Diabolus to make a retreat. But I cannot tell how, but the brave Captain Credence, Captain Goodhope, and Captain Experience, as they were in the pursuit, cutting down and following hard after the enemy in the rear, Captain Credence stumbled and fell, by which fall he caught so great a hurt that he could not rise till Captain Experience did help him up, at which their men were put in disorder. The captain also was so full of pain that he could not forbear but aloud to cry out. At this the other 2 captains fainted, supposing that Captain Credence had received his mortal wound. Their men also were more disordered, and had no list to fight. Now Diabolus, being very observing, though at this time as yet he was put to the worst, perceiving that a halt was made among the men that were the pursuers, what does he but, taking it for granted that the captains were either wounded or dead, He therefore makes at first a stand, then faces about, and so comes up upon the prince's army with as much of his fury as hell could help him to. And his hap was to fall in just among the three captains, Captain Credence, Captain Goodhope, and Captain Experience, and did cut, wound, and pierce them so dreadfully, that what through discouragement, what through disorder, and what through the wounds that they now had received, and also the loss of much blood, they scarce were able, though they had for their power the three best hands in man's soul, to get safe into the hold again. Now when the body of the prince's army saw how these three captains were put to the worst, they thought it their wisdom to make as safe and good a retreat as they could, and so returned by the sally-port again. And so there was an end of this present action. But Diabolus was so flushed with this night's work that he promised himself in few days an easy and complete conquest over the town of Mansoul. Wherefore on the day following he comes up to the sides thereof with great boldness, and demands entrance, and that forthwith they deliver themselves up to his government. The Dibelonians too that were within, they began to be somewhat brisk, as we shall show afterward. But the valiant Lord Mayor replied that what he got he must get by force, for as long as Emmanuel their prince was alive, though he at present was not so with them as they wished, they should never consent to yield man's soul up to another. And with that the Lord Will-be-will stood up and said, Diabolus, thou master of the den, and enemy to all that is good, we poor inhabitants of the town of Mansoul are too well acquainted with thy rule and government, and with the end of those things that for certain will follow submitting to thee, to do it. Wherefore, though while we were without knowledge we suffered thee to take us, as the bird that saw not the snare fell into the hands of the fowler, yet since we have been turned from darkness to light, we have also been turned from the power of Satan to God. And though through thy subtlety and also the subtlety of the Dibelonians within we have sustained much loss, and also plunged ourselves into much perplexity, yet give up ourselves, lay down our arms, and yield to so horrid a tyrant as thou, we shall not. Die upon the place we choose rather to do. Besides, we have hopes that in time deliverance will come from court unto us, and therefore we yet will maintain a war against thee. This brave speech of the Lord Will-be-will, with that also of the Lord Mayor, did somewhat abate the boldness of Diabolus, though it kindled the fury of his rage. It also succoured the townsmen and captains. Yea, it was as a plaster to the brave Captain Credence's wound. For you must know that a brave speech now, when the captains of the town with their men of war came home routed, and when the enemy took courage and boldness at the success that he had obtained to draw up to the walls and demand entrance as he did, was in season and also advantageous. The Lord Will-be-will also did play the man within, for while the captains and soldiers were in the field, he was in arms in the town, and wherever by him there was a Dibelonian found, they were forced to feel the weight of his heavy hand, and also the edge of his penetrating sword. Many therefore of the Dibelonians he wounded, as the Lord Cavil, the Lord Brisk, the Lord Pragmatic, and the Lord Murmur. Several also of the meaner sort he did sorely maim, though there cannot at this time an account be given you of any that he slew outright. The cause, or rather the advantage that my Lord Will-be-will had at this time to do thus, was for that the captains were gone out to fight the enemy in the field. For now, thought the Dibelonians within, is our time to stir and make an uproar in the town. What do they therefore but quickly get themselves into a body, and fall forthwith to hurricaning in man's soul, as if now nothing but whirlwind and tempest should be there. Wherefore, as I said, he takes this opportunity to fall in among them with his men, cutting and slashing with courage that was undaunted. At which the Dibelonians with all haste dispersed themselves to their holds, and my lord to his place as before. This brave act of my lord did somewhat revenge the wrong done by Diabolus to the captains, and also did let them know that Mansoul was not to be parted with for the loss of a victory or two, wherefore the wing of the tyrant was clipped again. As to boasting, I mean in comparison of what he would have done if the Dibelonians had put the town to the same plight to which he had put the captains. Well, Diabolus yet resolves to have the other bout with Mansoul. For, thought he, since I beat them once, I may beat them twice. Wherefore he commanded his men to be ready at such an hour of the night to make a fresh assault upon the town, and he gave it out in special that they should bend all their force against Field Gate, and attempt to break into the town through that. The word that then he did give to his officers and soldiers was hell-fire. And, said he, if we break in upon them as I wish we do, either with some or with all our force, let them that break in look to it, that they forget not the word, and let nothing be heard in the town of Mansoul but hell-fire, hell-fire, hell-fire. The drummer was also to beat without ceasing, and the standard-bearers were to display their colours. The soldiers too were to put on what courage they could, and to see that they played manfully their parts against the town. So when night was come, and all things by the tyrant made ready for the work, he suddenly makes his assault upon Field Gate, and after he had a while struggled there, he throws the gate wide open. For the truth is, those gates were but weak, and so most easily made to yield. When Diabolus had thus far made his attempt, he placed his captains, namely Torment and No Ease, there. So he attempted to press forward, but the prince's captains came down upon him, and made his entrance more difficult than he desired. And, to speak truth, they made what resistance they could. But the three of their best and most valiant captains being wounded, and by their wounds made much incapable of doing the town that service they would, and all the rest having more than their hands full of the doubters and their captains that did follow Diabolus, they were overpowered with force, nor could they keep them out of the town. Wherefore the prince's men and their captains betook themselves to the castle, as to the stronghold of the town. And this they did partly for their own security, partly for the security of the town, and partly, or rather chiefly, to preserve to Emmanuel the prerogative royal of Mansoul, for so was the castle of Mansoul. The captains therefore being fled into the castle, the enemy, without much resistance, possessed themselves of the rest of the town, and spreading themselves as they went into every corner, they cried out as they marched according to the command of the tyrant, Hell-fire! 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 So that nothing for a while throughout the town of Mansoul could be heard but the direful noise of hell-fire, together with the roaring of Diabolus's drum. And now did the clouds hang black over Mansoul, nor to reason did anything but ruin seem to attend it. Diabolus also quartered his soldiers in the houses of the inhabitants of the town of Mansoul. Yea, the subordinate preacher's house was as full of these outlandish doubters as ever it could hold, and so was my lord Mayor's, and my lord Wilby-Will's also. Yea, where was there a corner, a cottage, a barn, or a hog-sty, that now was not full of these vermin? Yea, they turned the men of the town out of their houses, and would lie in their beds, and sit at their tables themselves. Ah, poor Mansoul, now thou feelest the fruits of sin. Yea, what venom was in the flattering words of Mr. Carnal Security! They made great havoc of whatever they laid their hands on. Yea, they fired the town in several places. Many young children also were by them dashed in pieces, and those that were yet unborn they destroyed in their mothers' wombs. For you must needs think that it could not now be otherwise. For what conscience, what pity, what bowels of compassion can any expect at the hands of outlandish doubters? Many in Mansoul that were women, both young and old, they forced, ravished, and beast-like abused, so that they swooned, miscarried, and many of them died. And so lay at the top of every street, and in all by-places of the town. And now did Mansoul seem to be nothing but a den of dragons, an emblem of hell, and a place of total darkness. Now did Mansoul lie almost like the barren wilderness. Nothing but nettles, briars, thorns, weeds, and stinking things seemed now to cover the face of Mansoul. I told you before how that these Dibelonian doubters turned the men of Mansoul out of their beds, and now I will add, they wounded them, they mauled them, yea, and almost brained many of them. Many, did I say, yea, most, if not all of them. Mr. Conscience they so wounded, yea, and his wounds so festered, that he could have no ease day or night, but lay as if continually upon a rack. But that Shaddai rules all, certainly they had slain him outright. Mr. Lord Mayor they so abused that they almost put out his eyes, and had not my Lord Wilbywill got into the castle, they intended to have chopped him all to pieces, for they did look upon him, as his heart now stood, to be one of the very worst that was in man's soul against Diabolus and his crew. And indeed he hath showed himself a man, and more of his exploits you will hear of afterwards. Now, a man might have walked for days together in man's soul, and scarcely have seen one in the town that looked like a religious man. Oh, the fearful state of man's soul now! Now every corner swarmed with outlandish doubters. Red coats and black coats walked the town by clusters, and filled up all the houses with hideous noises, vain songs, lying stories, and blasphemous language against Shaddai and his son. Now also those Diabolonians that lurked in the walls and dens and holes that were in the town of man's soul came forth and showed themselves, yea, walked with open face in company with the doubters that were in man's soul. Yea, they had more boldness now to walk the streets, to haunt the houses, and to show themselves abroad, than had any of the honest inhabitants of the now woeful town of man's soul. But Diabolus and his outlandish men were not at peace in man's soul, for they were not there entertained as were the captains and forces of Emmanuel. The townsmen did browbeat them what they could, nor did they partake or make straw of any of the necessaries of man's soul, but that which they seized on against the townsmen's will. What they could they hid from them, and what they could not they had with an ill will. They, poor hearts, had rather have had their room than their company, but they were at present their captives, and their captives for the present they were forced to be. But, I say, they discountenanced them as much as they were able, and showed them all the dislike that they could. The captains also from the castle did hold them in continual play with their slings, to the chafing and fretting of their minds of the enemies. True, Diabolus made a great many attempts to have broken open the gates of the castle, but Mr. Godly Fear was made the keeper of that, and he was a man of that courage, conduct, and valour, that it was in vain, as long as life lasted within him, to think to do that work, though mostly desired, wherefore all the attempts that Diabolus made against him were fruitless. I have wished sometimes that that man had had the whole rule of the town of man's soul. Well, this was the condition of the town of man's soul for about 2 years and a half. The body of the town was the seat of war, the people of the town were driven into holes, and the glory of man's soul was laid in the dust. What rest, then, could be to the inhabitants? What peace could man's soul have, and what sun could shine upon it? Had the enemy lain so long without in the plain against the town, it had been enough to have famished them. But now, when they shall be within, when the town shall be their tent, their trench, and fort against the castle that was in the town, when the town shall be against the town, and shall serve to be a defence to the enemies of her strength and life, I say, when they shall make use of the forts and townholds to secure themselves in, even till they shall take, spoil, and demolish the castle. This was terrible, and yet this was now the state of the town of man's soul. End of chapter 14.